Do people always mean exactly what they say? Is our language alone enough to convey everything we need and want to say to others? In just a moment, we're going to show you what the linguist means by meaning and how his approach to meaning can make us conscious of many things we do that help us, sometimes force us, to say exactly what we mean. Our last program was a program about reading. And we found out that the educator was concerned in the process of reading with getting meaning from the printed page, where the linguist was concerned more with the nature of reading before he felt we could get to its purpose. Well, this program is a program about meaning. Now, meaning, like every other word in our language, means many things to many different people. Now, what does meaning mean to the linguist? Well, to the linguist, meaning has to be looked at first through structure. In other words, the linguist has found that until he can understand structure, he can never understand meaning or begin to even approach the problem of meaning. Because he has found out that he can never get at structure through meaning. In other words, because he can't get at structure through meaning, he feels convinced that he will never get at meaning except through structure, through pattern. Now, as we've found out also in this series of programs, the whole business of language is completely arbitrary. It's completely customary. There's no necessary reason why words have to refer to certain things. We've watched this. We found out, for instance, that this thing would still be my hand, whether I called it hand or the Frenchman called it la main or the German Hand. We found that if we had all learned and grown up to call this thing hand and this thing foot, none of us would be the wiser. We found out, in other words, that words don't have meaning, and words don't have to mean what sometimes we think they mean. This arbitrariness, this customariness, and this fact that meaning never resides in only one part of a structure, this is what we've been examining. Now, therefore, the linguist says, since meaning can never be in any one part of a structure, since it can't be just in a word or just in a sound or just in a pattern of a sentence, he says that in order to find out how meaning really operates, I'll have to find out how structures structure with structures, because it's the totality of interrelated structures which has to be the basis from which I seek meaning. Now, this whole business of meaning, as far as the linguist is concerned, I think as far as any one of us as human beings is concerned, is really the matter of communication. That is, communication between people. So to concern ourselves with communication, right away we have to concern ourselves with people. And to concern ourselves with people means we're concerning ourselves with people interacting through the medium of their language. Yes, but language isn't the whole business. On our very first program, we found that there were other systems of communication through which people sent messages to each other. And we're going to be talking about some of those in some detail on this program today. But the important thing right now is to remember this, that people learn to interact because they have learned systems through which they can interact. But again, people don't talk in a vacuum. Language doesn't exist in a vacuum. Language is, as we've already found out, inextricably bound up with the rest of culture. Language is culture, and culture is language. By which, what do I mean? In terms of this matter of meaning, what does this mean? In terms of communication, what does this particular statement mean? It means this, that people can only interact through a common cultural experience, through common expectancies, through things that they have learned to expect, in many cases outside of their awareness. In other words, people interact through their common culture, which means the things they see around them, the things they handle, their values, their attitudes, and their assumptions. In other words, this business which comprises our total way of life, the rest of our culture, that is the very stuff of our thoughts and ideas. And as we've seen, one of the purposes of talking is to be able to communicate, if you will, these thoughts and ideas. But those thoughts and ideas are not up there in a plane somewhere, way up in left field or on cloud nine. They are the stuff of our everyday life. Now, if we look then at communication as interaction between people, we have to see people then not just as simple machines. In other words, we can't see people, I feel, as just black boxes. As here, for instance. Here is A and B, like black boxes. One model of communication actually has A and B as encoders and decoders of messages. Simply that. In other words, A starts to encode a message and he sends it over to B, and then B puts on his machine and he decodes it, and then he becomes an encoder and he sends a similar message back or a different message back, and that's decoded by A. This obviously makes us look only at the structure of the message and how the message is being received. It tells us nothing about why the message was sent. And yet that is very important in the whole matter of communication. In other words, I would say that the black box model is too simple. Now, consequently, I would suggest, in terms of what I've said about the fact that we have to interact in terms of our common cultural experience, that A and B are constantly overlapping as they are interacting, because A and B have a common cultural experience. And it's not just A and B who are doing their interacting together. A and B, even when they are actually interacting without realizing it through n number of other people. People with whom they have previously interacted in the culture, people from which and from whom they have learned their common cultural experience. In other words, communication becomes this kind of overlapping, interactional, integrated kind of thing, not just a simple matter of a black box. Now, in this matter of interaction, and that's what communication is, interaction between people, what people actually do is to send themselves, so to speak, what we can call cross-referencing signals. That is, we are constantly sending ourselves messages as to who we think we are, who we think the other person is, how we think the other person relates to us, how we think that other person ought to relate to us, and that we ought to expect his interrelationship, etc., etc., etc. A whole series of identifying or cross-referencing signals go all along this business of interaction. Now, language itself, of course, is the most important, the most highly structured, the most completely patterned of all of the other systems of communication. But language itself can actually send cross-referencing signals, or almost, so to speak, comments on itself as it goes on. For instance, if I just say a sentence like, he saw my hand. Now, the word hand, pronounced that way, doesn't strike you as being anything except, shall we say, normal. But if I should say, he saw my hand, that way, immediately this would give you a sort of a double take. Why did he do it that way? That doesn't sound as though it fitted. And if I had said, he saw my and like that with no H on it, you'd say, it sounds Cockney. Or if you'd ever heard a Cockney, you'd say that sounded like a Cockney. In other words, the very way in which we pronounce words can give us cross-referencing signals in terms of status, in terms of geographical region, in terms of a whole lot of other things. We're constantly receiving these, understanding them, and integrating them. Now, in this series of ours, what we've had to do, because we've been concerned about the structure of language, is to pull it, so to speak, out of the package of communication where we always find it. Language never exists in a vacuum. We have, yes, blocked it like this, pulled it out to examine its structure on this series of programs. But always let us remember, in terms of communication, language is surrounded by what we called in our very first program, paralanguage and kinesics. Paralanguage, you may remember, were the tone of voice phenomena, if you will. And kinesics, that was the structured and the systematized and the learned use of bodily motion in communication. In other words, language has to be found, always is found and has to operate in terms of all of these other systematic structurings, these other modes of communication, these other communication systems. We never find it just by itself. Now, in terms of the structuring of this package, I'd like to go now to that part we call paralanguage and see what paralanguage is composed of. Now, paralanguage we find we can divide on two levels, what we call voice quality and what we call vocalizations. Now, voice quality is a part of this whole matter of interacting whereby we are sending messages that are telling us time and time again who we think we are, our conception or our image, so to speak, of ourself. In other words, a man in the prime of life would use a voice quality that would give us an idea of vigor overall. If we found a man in the prime of life who talked to us in a quavering voice like this, as though he were on the very brink of the grave, we would find that this would be very peculiar and wouldn't fit at all with our image, and we wonder what kind of an image he had of himself. This business of voice quality can actually be seen to match. That is, we have, for instance, the voice quality of precise articulation balanced by a voice quality of sloppy articulation. We have a certain kind of tempo increase and decrease, and these particular things can go over whole stretches of utterance. They may last for as much as an hour. I suppose if somebody has always felt sick, he might have that particular voice quality all his life. In other words, this business of voice quality is constantly giving us an idea of who the other person thinks he is, how he feels, and if everything matches, we get the proper kind of cross-referencing signals, and we find we can relate to that person relatively simply. Now, to drop down here for a moment to the vocalizations. The vocal characterizers, I'd like to say something about first, and then I'll examine the other two in some detail. The vocal characterizers cover much less space than does voice quality. Vocal characterizers are, for instance, the business of laughing and crying. Here's a typical pair of vocal characterizers. I can talk through my tears, for instance. I mean, talk through my laughter. If I'm, that was a real good joke I heard yesterday. Here I am, I'm laughing, and I'm actually talking through laughter, you see. I can talk through sobs. The breaking of the voice as a vocal characterizer. For instance, if I say, yeah, I think I could do that. Well, if I do that, that kind of breaking of the voice signals I'm not quite sure I can do it. And that breaking of the voice used in another context gives us quite a different feeling in terms of how the communication is going on. When the politician says, and I know you'll all vote for me because I have your interest at heart, and only your interest at heart, that's supposed to make us realize that the politician is deeply concerned about us emotionally. Whether it comes off or not, I leave up to you. In other words, these particular kinds of things that go over quite a stretch, again, in vocalizations, are what we call vocal characterizers. Now, as we narrow down in terms of the time, we find that in our vocal qualifiers, the next one of our vocalizations here, that we can actually take three particular levels of phenomena: intensity or loudness, pitch, and duration. And that we can actually measure from a baseline in which has been established in the communication situation 1 degree of overloudness, 2 degrees of overloudness, 3 degrees of overloudness. For instance, if I say, I want you to hear this, I've actually put 1 degree of overloudness from the baseline of the conversational tone I'm using talking to you right now. If I said, I want you to hear this, that would be 2 degrees of overloudness. And if I said, I want you to hear this, that would be 3 degrees of overloudness. The same way with oversoftness. And pitch works the same way. Over high and over low pitch to 3 degrees, very easily measured in terms of the baseline that has been established. By the same token, this matter of duration, drawl. For instance, if I say something like, he saw my hand, there's no drawl. But if I say he saw my hand, that's not drawl. If I say he saw my hand, plus drawl. He saw my hand, double plus drawl. And I can clip the same way. For instance, I can say, yeah, that's drawl. But if I say, yeah, that's double plus clipping. Yeah, you're exactly right. That's the word yeah or yes said with double plus clipping. In other words, then, I find that I can quite accurately measure these particular kinds of phenomena of loudness and of pitch and of duration, 3 degrees of them from a baseline, and that these particular kinds of things stretch over now not more than about 4 words. Then I have my last line of vocalizations, my vocal segregates. Now, the vocal segregates are actually single events that I can pull out of the whole business of paralanguage. For instance, this one here, this E turned around backwards, stands for the sound you hear when people say yeah, and so on. This is This is the thing you hear in that little glottal catch, and this is the thing you hear in that H-like sound. This is actual silence. These are inspiration and expiration. There are various kinds of clicks, like things like that. Now, also, these vocal segregates, which can exist, so to speak, by themselves, as this one of silence can, this one here, which is actual silence, stopping talking, cessation of phonation, we call it. We stop talking entirely for a split second or a little more. These things now, however, can be put together into packages. So I can get or ha, with half nasalization, and with full nasalization. That M stands for closed lip nasalization. Then notice I can put these things into packages. not only with themselves, but with language. So I get such a thing as this one here with an intonation pattern on it. That says, comes down to pitch 1, double cross juncture, And this would say, pardon me, there it is. And over here I can put vocal qualifiers even on them. These others are typical of the same kind of thing. For instance, here I can say, with plus drawl on it, like that, you see. This shows me then that in this particular kind of area that we're examining, we can be extremely accurate in picking out the events and seeing how the events structure together. Now again, this business of the meaning. How much meaning do we have here in this kind of thing? Do any one of these things mean one thing? No. The said means something different from the said without that drawl. Meaning, again, here in paralanguage is a matter of pattern with pattern. But paralanguage isn't the whole thing. Kinesics now. How about this business of kinesics? Well, in kinesics, where we're dealing with bodily motion, again, the kinds of events that we can pull out of context, these events are not single events that have meaning in and of themselves. They exist actually only, again, in terms of pattern. So, for instance, if I should wink my eye at you, like that, what would that mean? Well, I can tell you this. It would mean much more, if you will, if you saw it in its real context, or say a real context where I would use it, say something like that. Or notice my head's come down, my eyebrows have gone up, my lip has gone up. That's a knowing wink, shall we say. In other words, the wink, the little atomistic part of this business, that doesn't carry meaning. Meaning comes from the whole environment in which we see it. And obviously, kinesics is not the whole of communication any more than language is, or paralanguage is. Kinesics obviously has to go along with all of the other two. Now, kinesics, however, not only is a series of these kinds of packages, and they're what we call kinemorphic construction. They're composed of little units we call kinds. We even have motion qualifiers. Just as we have voice qualifiers, we have motion qualifiers. But the important point about kinesics that I want to bring out right now is that at times we have got to make some kind of bodily motion when we talk. It is impossible for us to say certain kinds of sentences without actually using kinesics. For instance, let me give you an example. Try to ask a simple question like this one. Really? Just one word. Really? Notice what I've done. In order to show the person I'm really interested, I have leaned forward. Notice what happens to my eyes. You see how they blink? And my eyebrows have gone up. And I, along with that intonation pattern with the double bar juncture, I give you this digging motion. You see, I'm really digging it. Really? Well, this is an obvious use of it. Now, how about, though, what we call the typical kinesic marker, or another typical kinesic marker, the one that I have to use when I even make a simple sentence, say a simple sentence like John gave Bill money. I know you couldn't see it then, but when I said John gave Bill money, just before I said money, up went my eyebrow. I have got to do something with my body when I say a sentence like that before I get to money. Now, I can either say John gave Bill money, you see I can do it that way, or I can say John gave Bill money. I can even move my hand or my foot. John gave Bill money. My foot or my leg. In other words, kinesics has to be used at certain times. We can't escape it. And this whole matter, then, of how these things fit together, what we call now congruence. If everything fits as we expect, we have what we call congruence, and the interaction goes along swimmingly. But if any one part of the business doesn't, then we have a problem. In other words, this matter of congruence, again, I think can be best understood if we return now again to our package. And here in our package, here is language, here's paralanguage, and here's kinesics. If anything goes wrong or seems to be out of balance, immediately something has happened. I get a jar. For instance, if I should say to you, good morning, that kind of kinesics makes perfect sense. But if I should say to you, good morning, with that kind of kinesics and all that, obviously there is a distinct incongruence here. The message that the words say is not in keeping with the way I have expected that kind of message to be used in terms of my past cultural experience. And that kind of incongruence then leads me to a very, very systematic way of taking apart what really goes on in communication and clocking what is congruent and what is not congruent. In other words, when I find my incongruences in terms of my patterning of all the systems, then one thing I know has happened. New information has been injected into the communication situation, and I'd better look right there, because something that is incongruent has taken place. And that tells me new information unexpected information has taken place. In other words, what we can do then, when we understand how the interaction situation takes place, the communication situation takes place, and when we have, as we now have, a means of breaking down this business minutely, is to actually find out what is going on. Now, I'd like to show you a chart that we actually use in our laboratory. This particular chart covers only, there's a part that I'm looking at right here, you're looking at right here, covers only 3/10 of a second. Every one of these little stretches here is a 1/10 of a second. Here up at the top of the chart, all of our vocalizations, all of our paralanguage business can be charted. Nothing was actually said at this point. And what you see here, head and face, for instance, head, forehead, brows, eyes, nose, cheeks, mouth, every little kind, every little minute to the 1/10 of a second movement of the body has been recorded. We can record shoulders, neck, trunk, neck, shoulders, right arm, left hand, left arm, right leg, left foot. The whole business can be recorded, and when we have that kind of minute or microkinesic or microlinguistic or paralinguistic breakdown, we have the events that actually occurred. Now our problem is, how can we then use this information to help evaluate, again, what is going on in an interaction situation? Obviously, this kind of approach is of great help to those people who are concerned with evaluating interviews of any kind, but particularly the psychotherapeutic interview. How are the patient and the therapist relating to each other? How is the patient affecting the therapist? And how is the therapist, in turn, through getting signals from the patient, who maybe is disturbed, then feeding back and affecting the patient? Well, I'm going to show you now an actual breakdown, an actual sentence that came from a psychotherapeutic interview. A young woman was concerned at this point about her child, and she was talking to the psychiatrist about her child, and what she said was, there's practically a sibling relationship between the kids. That's just the English orthography, the spelling. I'll say it again for you. There's practically a sibling relationship between the kids. Now, in terms of language alone, I want to show you one thing. She started to say they practically, and she stopped at this point. Then she started again, and she said there's practically a sibling relationship between the kids. Notice, please, how she pronounced the word relationship. Notice that this particular pronunciation is quite, well, it's noticeable, let's put it that way. And that is a very, if you will, tony pronunciation of this word, with this esh retracted as in relationship. But when she got over here to the word kids, she put a vowel in it, this one, which comes out kids. And that pronunciation of kids is not considered very tony. We have right in language itself, then, an incongruence right here of very tony and quite not tony. Now, if we drop down to our second line, the vocal segregates, which we recorded first here, please notice this vocal segregate of complete silence, where she interrupted herself and started over again. And over here, at the end of the whole business, she has a vocal segregate again of complete silence, actually before she stopped talking. This is a very unusual and peculiar circumstance. She really stopped talking before she stopped talking, so to speak. Again, a noticeable incongruence. Now, in terms of the vocal qualifiers, when she started off to say they practically and then corrected herself, she went up to 1 degree of over high pitch. They practically, here, just like that. Then over here at this point in the vocal qualifier range, she dropped to over softness of 1 degree on relationship and also between them. Then, in terms of vocal characterizers, she increases her muffling throughout this entire point between the kids. But when she gets to this point, we now drop to our voice quality, or go up to our voice quality level. Here she increased the forcefulness tremendously between the kids. Now, this particular business of muffling, of forcefulness, of stopping talking before you stop talking, of this kind of incongruence, is terrifically important. These incongruences in language alone would make the linguist say to any psychiatrist, watch this particular section here. Something is going on. Now notice, the linguist is not going to interpret this. He puts a flag on it. He says here is incongruence. Meaning, real meaning perhaps outside of the awareness of this patient is being injected into the situation at this point. But look at the kinesics now. The kinesics bears this out in a very amazing way. At this point, I have only room for the head. Obviously, the board is not sufficiently long. Now, at this particular time, when she said they practically, she shook her head and brought it back right in line with this particular break. They practically, as though she said, oh, I didn't mean to say that, and I'm going to start again. But even when she started again and said there's practically and so on, she still shook her head in the same way. In other words, what does it mean when you make a direct statement and then shake your head violently? I don't know, but it's incongruent, and we put a flag on it. She also, at this point, lowered her eyes out of focus, away from the psychiatrist, right exactly at that point of the break. See, it lines up completely. These things are patterning now within patterns. Then, on the second thing, she lowered her lids, still out of view of the psychiatrist, kept her lids lowered, and at the end of the thing over here, this visible inspiration, she sucked in her breath, which could be actually seen, and that corresponded with the vocal segregate of silence where she used it before she stopped talking. In other words, this kind of, shall I say, patterned incongruence makes both linguists and kinesiologists put a flag on this passage and say, psychiatrist, look here and see what relationship is really being spoken about. Perhaps you'll find something of considerable interest. Now, obviously, then, the linguist can't say anything about what meaning really means, as you will see, unless he is going to understand that structure comes first. We're not interpreting this particular business. What we're doing is simply saying, here is where you look for real information, because there's something incongruent here. Meaning can be found not in any one part, but in the totality of the patterning. And this kind of thing, this kind of way of looking at communication makes us aware of ourselves. And when we become aware of ourselves and how we are relating to others in our culture, when we really learn to see and hear, I think we've gone a long way toward understanding the differences between ourselves and other people. And I know of nothing more important in this divided and shrinking world today than to understand ourselves and understand the differences between ourselves and other people. The meaning of interaction can come from these kinds of studies. Now, in this series of programs, we have endeavored to show you something about communication, but particularly, of course, about language. We have pulled language out of the package, and we have talked about language and writing, about how linguistics can help in the teaching of a foreign language. We've seen how it can be applied to teaching of reading. We've seen something about English grammar, about correctness. We've talked about primitive languages, are there any? We've seen the history of our own language family, the history of English and its spread, and we have also seen how patterning works at every level. There's one thing I hope you have gotten from this series. It is that patterning is all important. Patterning is the real thread that has gone through this entire business. And at the very end of our series, we've seen some applications in the teaching of reading and to the psychotherapeutic interview. It's been a great pleasure for me to have been on this series. And at this point, I'd like to say that I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. And I want to thank you, and thank you very much for having been with us.
This is National Educational Television.